So, we moved to Romania as a family in the early 1990s. Things like gummy bears and brown sugar, even chocolate were hard to come by. But you know what wasn't hard to come by? Hot, fresh bread. I remember walking up to the bakery every morning and every evening was one of the most fought over chores that us three kids fought over. And so we ended up just all going together because none of us wanted to miss out. So my mom would tuck an extra 10 cents into our pocket so that we could enjoy a hot, fresh loaf right out of the oven every time we went up. And we would burn our hands trying to cram as much of this fresh bread in our mouths as we could walking home from the bakery. It just tasted so good. No matter if I've just had a delicious meal, there's something about hot, fresh bread that just awakens me. Can you remember like the best bread that you've ever had? Maybe it's your Nana's rolls that she bakes only at Christmas time, or maybe your mom's pizza crust that you still haven't gotten the recipe for. There's just something about, take a deep aroma, hot, fresh bread. And here we have the story of Jesus performing a miracle with the most fundamental of elements, bread. In my Ignatian reading of Scripture, please forgive, I don't want to offend any evangelical sensibilities here, but I imagine the little boy's mother gently kneading, making this dough at home, sticking it in the oven, the aroma of bread filling their house, coming out of the oven, and her slapping her boy's hands away just to wait till lunch, little buddy. Her lovingly packing it in a bag. Him anticipating, touching it, just anticipating what it's going to taste like. I wonder what it was like for him to give that to the disciples. Oh, the disciples, though, man, they're struggling a little bit here in the text. Can you feel that angst? Let's talk for a minute about these guys. Earlier in Mark 6, beginning of the chapter, we see that they're sent out by Jesus on their first ministry trip by themselves. But they feel pretty cool, right? And God, by the Spirit, really shows up. Miracles are happening. Healing is taking place. The blind are seeing. The deaf can hear. Demons are being cast out. And so they come back to Jesus and report all that is being done. Wouldn't you like to be a fly in that room? Those stories, those experiences was wonderful, awesome, epic. Jesus, it's really happening, the things that you're telling us that it will. And then imagine the shock and horror when they're told that the very guy who launched Jesus' public ministry and who some of them might have even followed, John the Baptist, has been beheaded. In the midst of signs and wonders and miracles, at the very same time that God is really showing up, a fellow ministry leader has been brutally murdered. Have you ever been in a room where all the air has just been sucked out? A piece of news that shifts everything when it seems like everything's going great, only to find out that things are not as they seemed? For me, it was a termination letter in the middle of a really fruitful time of ministry as a dean at a London seminary.
For me, it was this week, being in the midst of my studies, hearing from God, and yet hearing on the phone from my wife, this pace of ministry is hurting me, and it's hurting our boys.
For me, it was a life-threatening spinal tumor. In the midst of my IWS studies last year.
For me, it was sitting in my car at an ATM machine, staring down the barrel of a semi-automatic 45mm weapon, in the midst of just developing a new life and receiving a new career, not knowing whether I was going to live or die.
It was waking up to learn that my brother had committed suicide.
It's like Elijah during the most epic ministry showdown in history when God literally rains down fire, and yet he finds himself scared for his life, hiding under a broom bush in the wilderness and just wishing to die. From a tremendous high to a tremendous low. No matter how awesome God moves at church on Sunday morning, anyone else just want to hide under their covers all day on Monday just watching Netflix? So the disciples are in a storm of emotions, high and exhausted off the fumes of a huge ministry success, and yet at the same time experiencing the depths of shock and horror and disappointment and grief. How could this happen? God, why did this happen? And then in the midst of the storms, we have the crowds. Don't we all know about these crowds, right? Our beloved crowds. The before church crowds, the after church crowds, the 9 p.m. phone call crowds, the I'll walk you out to the car crowds, the it'll only take a minute crowds, the I didn't have a chance to eat today because of the crowds. I know we've all had these days. The constant comings and goings. We've been there. We've all been with the crowds riding on the highs of ministry. And we've all been with the crowds in the lows of heartbreak. We've all been with the crowds tired and exhausted and spent. Jesus gets this. He understands. And he initiates a time of rest by taking his grieving, exhausted disciples away to a secluded place. Come away by yourselves and rest a while. See, anyone here could use a desolate place to rest a while alone? Yes. See, I love the song that we sang at the beginning, Miracle Worker. I actually first heard it when we were in Iraq in November, and it was sung first, I think, in Kurdish or Turkish or Arabic. And it was awesome. We were getting fired up. And then this Messianic Jew enters into this conversation, and he says, you know, the God who never stops working actually does stop working. It's called Shabbat. It's called the Sabbath. It's called come away and rest a while. The God who is always active and engaged and fully attentive within his creation is also really good at resting. And we see here that his desire is for rested disciples, not depleted ones, not running on fumes of ministry ones. Let me say that to you again. God's desire is for your rest. God's desire is for your rest. God's desire is for your rest. And then we have our lovely, beloved, persistent crowds figuring out where these guys were headed and get there before they arrive by boat. And now the very place that was intended for rest now becomes full of the pressure and the expectation to minister. And so the disciples who are exhausted, tired, disillusioned, broken, and grieving are now expected to meet at least, 5,000? You guys would know more. Spiritual and physical needs. They aren't at their best to be ministering. They aren't at their best at all. Can you remember a time or a season where you had to minister out of a dark place in your own life? We've all been there. And after what probably felt like the longest ministry day of these guys' lives, the disciples begged Jesus to send the crowds away. We've had enough. We're spent. We can't do this anymore. Send them away. Let them get their own food. Jesus responds, bless his heart, after all the disciples have been through, after all that they're going through. You give them something to eat. Excuse me, Jesus, are you kidding me? Who do you think we are? We don't have that kind of cash. 200 days' wages to buy enough bread to feed all those people. Again, how many loaves do you have? And Jesus took the 5 loaves, baked lovingly by a little boy's mom, and blessed them and broke them. The bread was multiplied. Everyone ate. Everyone was satisfied. Everyone had more than enough. In the middle of this desolate place that was supposed to be a resting place but turned into a ministry place, Jesus demonstrates his ability and his pleasure to provide abundantly. In the midst of ministry demands beyond capacity, the disciples dutifully executed what Jesus asked of them. And Jesus miraculously provides an overabundance of food. Herkeziyip doidu, an abundance of food, more than enough. And the real sign within the story isn't the bread itself, but it's Jesus pointing to himself as the living bread. I believe Jesus wanted to make it loud and clear to his exhausted, spent, burnt out disciples that he's more than capable of providing. He's literally multiplying bread in the disciples' hands to feed the needy crowds. He's putting fresh bread in their mouths as a sign to say, I am the bread of life. I am your living provision. He is your living provision. He's your living provision. He's your living provision. When the crowds find Jesus again, what's the first thing that they do? They ask for more bread, more healing, more deliverance, more ministry. Isn't that the way that it goes? Give me more bread. Satisfy my needs. We encounter these crowds who love to ask for the miracles, the programs, the outcomes. And if we're really honest with ourselves as ministers, we like to make this story about us, as if we're the one acting in the narrative, as if we're the promise, we're the healing, right? I gave Jesus the little that I had, and it was multiplied. But the story isn't about the disciples or the loaves or the little boy at all. And when we make it about ourselves and our ministries and our knowledge and what we have within those places, we're going to burn out because we're going to have to keep it about our knowledge and our abilities and the things that we have in our ministries. We'll run ourselves into the ground. We'll be buying 8 months of bread to feed the crowds that we'll just have to be feeding them again next Sunday. We'll constantly be chasing the latest and the greatest worship renewal trend to feed the needy crowds. Maybe some of us find ourselves chasing a degree to feed the needy crowds. Yet the only lasting, tried and true worship renewal trend is Jesus. Every other bread is going to leave us hungry and grumpy, empty and depleted. Jesus asks us tonight, are you distributing your own gifts and abilities and knowledge, or are you distributing me? He says, I am the only solution to lasting worship renewal. Not that Constance's books aren't super awesome, I wish she was here, or Alan's graphics aren't the best that we've ever seen. They just aren't the solution to worship renewal. Neither is incorporating a 6th century creed or a 20th century Anglican confession, although those things are important, but Jesus is our living provision. He is the key to worship renewal. He is a solution to our worship renewal needs. We don't have to go buying bread for everyone. We don't have to operate out of exhaustion and expectation and pressure, but Jesus desires and initiates rest. He wants us to operate out of a place of abundance. Cherith said this today to us in class. She said, Jesus wouldn't be able to stay on a church staff for 3 months. He wouldn't play that game. Yet the disciples missed it. In verse 50, it says that their hearts were hardened because they didn't understand about the loaves. Do you know that recent studies show how stress affects the brain's ability to effectively deal with and understand life by rewiring how your brain responds? In other words, under stress, toxins literally shut down your brain's ability to function properly. Guys, stress literally shut down the disciples' brains to understand what was really going on. They didn't understand that they didn't need to operate in a place within themselves. They didn't understand that Jesus is more than enough to meet not only their needs, but everyone's needs. They couldn't understand that the bread was just a sign pointing to Jesus, the bread maker. In the midst of grieving a dream job cut way too short, He is my good in this life and in the life to come.
In the midst of searching to try to figure out what He's trying to tell me and the uncertainty of knowing what to do next, I put my hope in the God who is provider and guide, anchor.
In the midst of my fear, pain, and helplessness, Jesus is the lover of my soul.
In the midst of staring at death, knowing that Jesus protects me and keeps me safe at all times.
After feeding the...
In the midst of despair, He is the resurrection and the life and my reason for living.
Amen. After feeding the 5,000, Jesus sends His disciples away on a boat by themselves, and He dismisses the crowd Himself. As a good leader, He's the one to stay back, shake hands, turn off the lights, pick up the coffee cups, stack the chairs. And then Jesus goes to pray on a mountain alone. He initiates rest for His own self. But then after seeing His disciples struggling, He rejoins them on the water. And I wonder how much time, again in my Ignatian reading, I wonder how much time passed on the boat that the disciples had with Jesus between mooring the boat and getting out of the boat. In Mark 6:53, it says, when they had crossed over, they came to a land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. In 54, when they got out of the boat, people at once recognized them, and so it goes. Right here, right now, is a special time when we've moored the boat, but we don't have to get out quite yet. Tomorrow you'll be getting out of the boat and getting back into the crowds of people who recognize you and need you. Tonight, you don't. So now would you imagine that you're on the boat with Jesus? The boat's moored. You have some time. You know the crowds are out there. But he's just saying, wait a minute. And here you are in the boat with Jesus. What's the need? What's the burden? What's this anxiety that you're carrying? Jesus speaks to that very place. I am your living provision. I am your living provision. His desire is for your peace. He wants you rested. He wants you in a place of abundance. The fresh bread of Jesus by his Spirit is available to minister to every need, every stress, every anxiety. His presence is here to silence every suicidal thought. His presence is abundant to heal and to restore. And just as God showed up in Elijah's depression after his ministry high with fresh bread baked on hot stones, he now shows up to us tonight, offering himself as our living provision. And as Elijah's bread was baked on stones, our own brokenness becomes the very place that the hot, fresh bread of Jesus' presence is manifest. Our own stones create the altar for Jesus' ministry in us and through us. And as he restores you, I believe you will be sent out by the Spirit's empowerment into the places of ministry, into your homes, as the hot, fresh bread of Jesus' presence. Not striving to feed the crowds with chunks of your own gifts and ability and knowledge, but offering the hot, fresh bread of Jesus' presence as he ministers in you and to you and through you. You aren't the bread and you can't make the bread, but you can carry and distribute the hot, fresh bread of Jesus' presence into the hungry places you are going back into. In a few minutes, we'll come forward to build the altar with our rocks and then partake of Jesus' body and blood as fortification and nourishment and empowerment for the journey back to where we've come from. There is also a prayer team here on the sides that's ready and prepared to pray for you. Please make the most of their healing ministry to you. But before we transition into that time, we wanted to give you a moment to reflect, to rest, to respond. Just you, in the midst of all of us, take this minute to converse with Jesus. He wants us launched out of here as bakeries of his aromatic presence, distributing his living provision to the needy crowds. As this next song plays, Jesus invites you into conversation. How may he desire to encounter you? What is his particular invitation to you regarding the stone that you're carrying and perhaps clinging to? Where may Jesus desire to minister deeply to you as your living provision?